Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In the last season, we talked a lot about command, dabbled in control, but took a largely tactical, land-centric view of C2. This season, we're broadening the conversation a bit, looking at some of the wider aspects of command and control. The show is once again sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic's world-leading command and control software, the Citaware Suite, is in use in 16 NATO countries and more than 50 militaries worldwide. Its open architecture allows complete integration with legacy systems while meeting all NATO interoperability standards, and its intuitive interface bridges language and domain barriers across alliances.
There is no doubt that, at least for now, command and control retains distinctly human elements, critical parts of decision-making, reporting, feedback analysis, and consideration that need human input. Other systems cannot yet provide the creativity, the innovation, the inventiveness that a human brain is able to provide. There's this continuity of command and control that has run for millennia. Alongside that has been the history of personalities of commanders, their ability to harness knowledge, experience, and decisions into the fighting power they exercise. And the names of these great commanders spring to mind as soon as we start talking about them, whether it's Napoleon, Sukhoi, Marcus Aurelius, Hannibal Barca, Ulysses S. Grant, or David Ben-Gurion. Those in the military might also be able to name a few bad commanders too. Being generous, you might say these personalities were unlucky, but there's more to it than that. We know the facets that make good and great commanders. We can identify those characteristics, yet often we don't pay much attention to them. Instead, the mythology of the genius general, the personality that possesses the mind of a kingfisher, someone with the ability to see the flashes of colour and opportunity within the cauldron of combat. They may be few and far between, but the brilliance of these combat leaders is rarely disputed. The idea of a born leader is popular within written fiction and some of the cinematography of the 20th and 21st centuries. That there's some kind of divine leadership, which is a natural phenomenon born of the few, is a really popular idea. Sure, adequate leaders can be nurtured according to teaching staff at staff colleges and military academies. But the great commander is apparently about lineage and their development. This whole narrative seems to me, at least, rather Victorian. I've heard several people speak about mythology and leadership and commanders. There are whole industries now that like to talk about leadership and followership, the servant leader, authoritative leadership, and even transformative leadership. Books litter the outer offices of senior military staff on the topic, as do military leading lists at defence universities around the world. Some of it is simple commercialisation of the space, but what we need is something with more actual utility. I've heard Sarah Chapman-Trimm speak about leadership in a completely different way on several occasions, usually to audiences across NATO. As a military psychologist, her specialisation is performance optimisation of individuals and teams. Sarah is one of the most in-demand speakers for military audiences because she talks from a perspective that blends the evidence with emotion and a deep understanding of military personnel, both in Europe and in Australia, where she served the Australian Defence Force and Royal Australian Navy on a number of projects. Sarah is currently Head of Culture at the UK Strategic Command, where she works on leadership, decision-making and the science of teamwork across all ranks within the UK Ministry of Defence. And we might come back to that all-round perspective if we have time. So Sarah, welcome to the show. I guess the first question any audience would want me to ask is, what can a psychologist offer to a discussion about command and control?
And Peter, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to be here. So as a psychologist, I'm focused on human behaviour, measuring it, predicting it, and changing it. And that is true of all psychologists, regardless of stripe. I believe that at its core, psychology is about two things. It's about pattern recognition in human behaviour and problem solving in an emotional context. Both of those have direct relevance, both to the military writ large, but also decision-making and command and control. And indeed, I would go so far as to say that all warfare is psychological. It's designed to alter human behaviour.
On that basis, both of those things, a lot of them come down to decision-making, right? And the way we think about decision-making, the way we train people to make decisions, which in military terms is somewhat different from we make them in society, right? So in society, even if you choose to go to the cinema, it's more of a collegiate thing. in militaries, it does revert to almost that military idea of being very hierarchical, where the general at the top, the admiral at the top says something and it cascades down and then people do what they say. And that's the way. So that theory of leadership, that theory of decision-making is quite different from militaries. Is that right?
So I'm not sure it's the theory necessarily. I think it's about the practice. And so we have hierarchies and we have systems of command and control for obvious reasons, because war can get very chaotic very quickly. And obviously the nature of the battle space is changing with the introduction of cyber and space. But nonetheless, we've got volume and pace of information. And we know that the decision quality is degraded under conditions of stress and fatigue. And so what we want to do is we want to be training people to be making decisions better. And of course, we're leaning into AI to try and reduce the volume of the information that people are presented with in order to make decisions. But actually, I think my concern and my focus is on the human being, because what happens when we take out the systems and we're left with the individual who needs to be making decisions, needs to be influencing others? And so that's sort of the focus that I have in terms of the decision-making model that I continue to talk about to NATO about least worst decisions. So most of the decisions that military personnel are faced with aren't easy decisions. An easy decision, by definition, has an optimal outcome. It's relatively easy to identify and implement. Whereas most military personnel and emergency services personnel, say fire, police, ambulance, but also emergency workers in hospitals and other high-stakes pressure environments, are having to make decisions where there is task ambiguity and outcome uncertainty. And those are the sort of two head marks in terms of what defines a least worst decision.
And that's very different, isn't it? Because we think about all military decisions as trying to make the best decision. Whenever you're in a position of leadership or command, you want to make the best possible decision. We don't really frame it in terms of the least worst decision. It's quite a difficult thing to get your head around, right? Because you think there must be a better way out of this. You're presented with courses of actions. There's two extremes. You pick a middle one. But we don't frame that often in terms of the least worst decision.
And Peter, I think we need to. I think so the commonly accepted definition of a decision is a commitment to a course of action, as you've identified, that is intended to produce a satisfying state of affairs. It's a nice definition, isn't it? But gosh, when you've got an incoming fire or a missile and you're having to make decisions quickly, it doesn't feel like a satisfying state of affairs. So the quality of a decision outcome is relatively easy to evaluate. But understanding why decisions are hard has proven more challenging. And colleagues of mine at the University of Liverpool, Lawrence Allison and Neil Shortland, in fact, Neil Shortland has now gone to the US, have written a brilliant book called Conflict, looking at this model of decision-making and using a naturalistic decision-making framework. They have done an extensive amount of research with United States Special Forces personnel, but also emergency services personnel in the UK. And they've identified the 7 factors thought to define hard decisions. And so this will resonate with a military audience and those who've had to make difficult decisions at pace. So volume of information, too much, too little, or contradictory. And we are seeing the introduction most recently in NATO with the TALIS product to reduce volume of information. So the volume of information the decision maker is having to sift through. So AI is helping us with that. Uncertainty and stress. So misinformation and high stakes. And there are also some interesting books being written now on misinformation and how we can deal with that from a psychological point of view. But inability to diagnose the problem. So interpreting cues correctly and recognizing redundancy and errors. Multi-agency communication. We're seeing this more and more as we move towards whether it's multi-domain operations, multi-domain integration, depending on how you define it. But also the NATO is working on a cross-domain command concept as well. So we're seeing this earlier within a career, working in multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional and multi-domain environments. But that communication that occurs across those boundaries is a challenge to decision-making because you're having to deal with competing agendas, incomplete information sharing and stovepipes. Emotion, so career fear, anticipatory regret and pride and loss. Confidence in yourself, the team or the agency you're working with. And finally, concerns about the legacy of the decision for victims, the community or an organization.
It's funny because anyone can relate to all those things in decision making, and the idea that systems will help particularly help you make the least worst decisions better, that they'll reduce the amount of information, they'll reduce some of the stresses that come from it. And I'm always struck by going back to Marcus Aurelius's great book Meditations, where after all his problems and considerations, he found that the one thing he needed was sort of boredom and thinking space and freedom. He needed to take himself away from all of it and think about this in a very different way, to spend time just pondering the outcomes and figuring out what was going to work for them. And I'm not sure that that features anywhere within anything that I'm seeing in command and control about leaders taking time to go for a walk, to smoke a cigarette, to have a pipe, to do whatever they do, but just to give themselves a bit of space. That strikes me as one of the biggest problems, perhaps less so than some of the other stuff that's been described. Do you think that's right? Or do you think that actually today there's no way that people can just take that time?
So I think it's the hallmark of a professional to take that time. I often say as a psychologist, we get better by doing, but we improve by reflection. And we often talk about delivering at pace. Well, how do you deliver at pace? An Olympic sprinter doesn't get out of bed in the morning and just randomly sprint off in a given direction. We deliver at pace because we take time to think about and improve our knowledge and our practice of our craft, whatever that is, during the slower times. And you need to wedge that in around the margins. I preach to the converted regardless of people's life circumstances when I say that I work in microbursts. Ferrying my children to activities and listening to podcasts. I am reading 2 chapters of a book very late at night before I go to bed. I'm doing my Duolingo on the train on the way to work. This is just the way we are these days. But I think that reflection is critical. I think it is important to be practicing, we're talking about decision-making in particular, least worst decisions and embedding that within our wargaming scenarios. So back in 2003, when I was the Maritime Task Group psychologist, Second Gulf War, I revamped our sea training around the hospital department on the ship to really inject that sort of fear and emotion and fatigue and stress that people had, rather than just going through the motions in terms of putting one foot in front of the other and delivering the scenarios. I think so with the least worst decision-making stuff, we need to be, and there is a methodology for this, creating these immersive scenarios for people to experience what it is like emotionally to be put in those contexts, but also to be thinking about the things that are unthinkable, if you will, and to be rehearsing those. And so we can draw upon sports psychology here in terms of emotional rehearsal. That's important. We don't want to over-index that, though, because I think, particularly in the leadership space, we talk a little bit too much about sports psychology and teams, because sporting teams self-evidently over-index talent. There are 8 dimensions of a high-performing team, and talent is only one of them. And if we linger too much on that, we tend to over-index the talent versus some of the other factors that are important. But we need to be practicing least worst decision-making, embedding it in our scenarios, embedding it in our wargaming, and putting us into those uncomfortable spaces. And then having those conversations at team level where the subject matter expertise exists of the what if and now what, and not just rehearsing known scenarios. We need to do that. But I guess the argument that I'm putting is that we need to be moving away from recognition, prime decision-making, into this more naturalistic decision-making model, which has been field-tested, as I said, with emergency services personnel and United States Special Forces personnel to considerable success.
So how would you define the naturalistic decision-making?
So it's the way people make decisions when they're presented with them. And so the way that, as I said, these 7 factors that have been identified as making decisions difficult has been identified through having interviews and observations of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emergency services and special forces personnel, asking them about difficult decisions and decisions that they were in that were characterized by task ambiguity and outcome uncertainty. So there might have been, and there was obviously in military terms, mission command and a dedicated sort of intent. But what went wrong? Where were the grey spaces? Where was the inconsistency? And what were the problems and challenges? And so these 7 factors have fallen out of that research.
So given those 7 factors then, I said in the introduction, you've talked about it a couple of times, or you intimated it. We know how to train commanders. We know how to train decision-making now, right?
We do, but what we're not doing is actually leaning into some of the space that we have around the predilections we have as decision makers. So, for example, the way an individual makes decisions in everyday life is a bit of a thumbprint, if you will, in terms of how they're likely to make decisions in high-pressure, high-stakes environments. And so we know that there are these sort of characteristics called satisficing. So some people are naturally predisposed to make decisions quickly based on minimal information. We also know that each of us has a tendency to maximization. We used to think of satisficing and maximizing as being on one continuum. We now know maximization is a dichotomous variable. So each of us has this in us to a greater or lesser extent. And it's self-evidently problematic for military personnel or people in high-risk, no-fail environments where a decision needs to be made quickly to continue to call for information long after the point has been reached where a decision has to be made to save lives and livelihood. And so we have ways of measuring maximization, and we have ways of measuring satisficing. And I think it would be very useful for us to start embedding that in our education and training, reflecting on it, using those measures so that people are armed with that awareness when they go into these environments. In this scenario, was I perhaps, tending towards maximization? At what point should I have made the decision? And that sort of awareness can be embedded in the wargaming. So I think with the satisficing, we want to hit a sweet spot, and that's where the training comes in. And so with the decision-making writ large, we know that more intelligent people are better able to make decisions and better quality decisions and more quickly, simply because they're able to hold more complex information in their heads at any one point in time. The good news for the rest of us is that everybody can get better through practice. So there is this dosage effect in terms of decision-making and improving our decision-making ability. Little and often accelerates experience and enables us to make better decisions when it counts.
And those decisions, for me, there's always something very different between a wartime commander and a peacetime commander, right? So someone who's dealing with spreadsheets and trying to balance budgets and thinking about lower levels of readiness and long-term versus the wartime commander, which for me is a very different kind of leadership, a very different kind of decision-making model. Are they very different?
So I think there's clearly an overlap between them, isn't there? But it's about appetite and capacity for risk. So we talked in the decision-making space about the ability to hold complex chunks of information in your head at any one point in time. And of course, no one individual, so we began this podcast talking about great man theory of leadership. No one individual actually is controlling the fray, are they? So Neil Armstrong did not put himself on the moon. The pharaohs did not build the pyramids. So throughout human history, it's collaborative or coordinated social enterprise that has led to magnificent achievement. Not always social enterprise. So, of course, the success of ancient Rome, the Roman Empire was built on slavery, but it wasn't, a handful of individuals. And I think it's certainly tracing back to Thomas Carlyle's work, the Scottish philosopher, Great Man Theory of Leadership. At any one point in time, this is true of a range of disciplines, he was looking at the information he had available to him. But if we look at the 21st century, just off the top of my head, there are some individuals that blow that out of the water who didn't fit that mold of great men achieving magnificent victory or magnificent success. And so amongst them, we have Alan Turing, and we have Marie Curie, and we have the three women who worked at NASA, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, who were instrumental in putting Neil Armstrong on the moon. And so I think certainly in terms of leadership and teams, we need to be moving far more into a space where we recognize not so much the binary conceptualization of leadership and followership, but the shared psychological space that exists between leaders and followers. So what makes a leader and what makes a follower a follower, and recognizing that changes over time and across context.
It's fascinating because the more you talk about it, and I'm reverting to type here, when I think about, Nelson being revered in navies, not just in the UK, but a lock of his hair sits in the Japanese Naval War College and all these other things where we hold up these individuals on a pedestal and we say, here is the example of brilliance that wins. As you say, it was nothing about him at Trafalgar that won the war. There was nothing about Field Marshal Haig or Wellington that actually won the war. The fighting was done by individuals on a very different level. And yet we tend to place these people, we revere them, we raise them to almost godlike status as the thing that we should be after. But I'm not sure it is, right? Actually, we only require these people when almost something has gone drastically wrong with decision making. Prior to that point, actually, we would want something very different. We don't want everyone to be this brilliant, right? A sort of leadership followership model can't work that way. If everyone is this brilliant, if everyone is so superb, then the leadership followership thing just doesn't work.
There's a couple of different ways to answer that question, actually. So I can talk about the dual agency theory of leadership and how we could conceive of leadership and followership and just leadership writ large, or we could talk about selection of wartime commanders and peacetime commanders and that dichotomy as well.
Let's do wartime peacetime commanders first and then go on to leadership followership.
Okay, so we don't select wartime commanders during peacetime. And this was something, Peter, that was raised a couple of weeks ago when you and I were together in Paris speaking to NATO. And the assertion was put that we can't identify wartime commanders. They emerge from the mist during a time of crisis. And of course, I immediately began scribbling because that's not the case. So that may well have been the case in 1914. It's no longer the case in 2024. So we have a wealth of data to suggest the ways in which we could go about selecting wartime commanders. Now, before I go through some of those, politically, do we want to be selecting and grooming wartime commanders and having them on ice, as it were, at the same time that we have our peacetime commanders? Well, in an era of persistent engagement, we probably do want all these people at the ready, right? So in the decision-making space as well, these wartime commanders can be identified by talent for decision-making as one criteria. But in terms of how we would go about identifying them, well, obviously it's unpopular, but intelligence is always going to be a factor because it's your ability to deal with complex information at pace and manage it. But it's not the be-all and end-all. So you don't have to be a genius. Decision-making ability, absolutely, but I've talked about the dosage effect in that little and often, and an awareness of your tendency for maximization and satisficing, and then practicing decision-making in difficult, challenging, and least worst scenarios. Then we have something called resilience. We have sort of 4 decades of data now on resilience or personality hardiness. Commitment, control, and challenge, 3 factors. And again, we don't necessarily talk about this, particularly in the UK. The US has done some magnificent work, particularly out of West Point Academy. And the Norwegians have also done some work with their special forces. There are 3 factors most predictive of everything from the length of time it's going to take you to recover from open heart surgery through to your ability to withstand difficulties and stress in special forces environments. So commitment being that you're enmeshed in your social environment. You belong to different clubs, you have different identities and different spaces in which to be and exist, so that if you experience challenge in one of those, you can move into a different role and manage and mitigate that stress. Control, internal, external locus and control. Again, certainly within psychology in the last sort of decade, if not 2, we've tried to move away from binary conceptualizations of on-off switches and continuums and things, and recognizing that it's about where we exist within that space. So internal locus of control, that you have agency over everything that happens to you, and external locus of control, you are at the whim and mercy of fate. And of course, neither of those extremes is true, is it? But our mentality can sometimes not help us. And so you want somebody who has a healthy ability to exist between those extremes and recognize that there are circumstances in which they don't have control, and there are other circumstances in which they can exercise some agency. And the last one being challenge. So when you are presented with difficulties and challenges in life, do you have the resources, both personally, socially, professionally, to manage those and to recognize them as a challenge and not a threat? Intelligence, decision-making ability, resilience. And then we've got some really interesting research going on at the moment in analog settings, looking at space research. And so we're putting people in caravans, if you will, in car parks, and isolating them for long periods of time as a group to identify the sorts of personality characteristics and tendencies in terms of group behavior that are helpful for individuals if they're going to live and work in confined environments for long periods of time. And certainly in my times, that great privilege being the submarine psychologist in the Royal Australian Navy gave me great insight into that. And it was one of the first places I pivoted to was the NASA research at the time and the Australian National Antarctic Research Expedition, as it was known. So what distinguishes these people and their ability to cope under pressure in isolated, confined, extreme environments? And the last one, Peter, would be the Big Five. Some people may or may not have sort of heard of it, but I talked about the difference between 1914 and 2024, and all of the research that we have that has sort of shone a light on the human condition and helped us to identify individuals that can survive and thrive in isolated, confined, extreme environments. So openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is an old-fashioned term for anxiety. And so if you think of an old-fashioned graphic equalizer model of those 5 characteristics, there would be something in that you would want to not necessarily measure with pinpoint accuracy, but try and develop and identify in your personnel.
It's funny when you talk about that. I was talking with someone the other day about high-level commanders and the idea that different people react differently based on their experiences, right? So we were talking about a former submariner who rose quite high within the British military, who was terrible in the headquarters. He couldn't relate to his staff. He didn't know what a chief of staff was supposed to do. It just didn't work from working in the headquarters. I mean, he had a brilliant mind, hugely intelligent, but couldn't interact with that many people and that level of decision making because he was used to operating in a very small bubble. And that was what sort of formed him. And he hadn't really shifted from that. And so when you put him, and it wasn't even interagency, but when you put him in that position of trying to take him outside of his small bubble, he was a very difficult personality to deal with. Really, really difficult. He didn't enjoy interacting with people. He wanted to be, the captain of his submarine again. He wanted to be the revered godlike figure who was the only person who made decisions, limited probably number of inputs coming to him, which they were all variables that he understood perfectly. He didn't have this. It was a very different way of thinking about it. And yet when he was CEO of his submarine, he was absolutely loved by his people. They absolutely adored him because he had probably similar traits to him. And this is, your recent paper on leadership followership. This is something that just struck me when I was reading it this morning before we chatted. This idea that actually he was part of that community and he represented them in such a way that they completely got his way of leadership in a way that a headquarters staff didn't outside his very small environment, right? And this leadership followership thing, which is seen as so polemic in many ways, is actually really important for us to understand, right?
Very important. And I could talk for hours about my all too limited time as a submarine psychologist. Submarines remain my first love. So just very quickly, interestingly, you're talking about peacetime, wartime commanders before we move off that. The French and the Dutch select managers, diplomats and warriors. And from, I think it's OF2 and above, they go to a personnel selection center and they are given in-tray exercises and things to measure and observe that performance in a headquarters-like environment. And the report from that sits alongside their blue jacket or their military file. And they deliberately raise these three types of leaders in recognition that, in time of war, they're going to break the seal and they're going to need their warrior type, their joint forces commander type. At other times, they're going to need a diplomat when they are arguing for funding. And then other times, they're going to want a manager, which could be a legal officer or a logistician. But equally, I don't think we should be necessarily pigeonholing people in terms of, well, you're a fast jet pilot, therefore you fall into the warrior bucket. Actually, you could have a fast jet pilot who's a magnificent diplomat for their service or who has a particular talent for management. But just getting on to the leadership followership piece. So yes, in my capacity as a senior research fellow for the Centre for Army Leadership, I was asked to write a leadership insight, and I chose to write about the dual agency theory of leadership, which doesn't otherwise tend to exist in the Ministry of Defence, developed by a professor who taught me at ANU actually many, many years ago, and based on social identity theory. So one of the greatest contributions to psychology in the 20th century was the identification of social identity theory. And in a nutshell, I began the podcast by talking about the fact that the individual is the basic unit of analysis in psychology. And we had looked at individuals for a very long time, individual differences and selection for leadership positions and all that sort of thing, and then looked at individuals within groups. And in an attempt to understand football rioting in Bristol, ironically enough, they happened upon this idea of how the group within the individual influences individual behavior. So how group memberships will influence individual behavior. And why is that important? Because your group memberships form your social identity. And so if I were to ask you, Peter, or any of our listeners, write down an A4 piece of paper who you are, a lot of that would be about your social identity as a parent, as a brother, how you exist out there in the world. So why is social identity important, particularly in a military context, and how can it help us? Is we talk about leadership, and we have talked about the great man theory of leadership for a very long time, and we recognized about 2 decades ago that that was a little bit on the nose because the majority of people within the organization aren't necessarily visible or senior leaders. They're actually busy delivering the organizational output. And so we swung the pendulum to followership. But in doing so, we miss the magic in the middle. We miss the thing that makes a leader and a follower a follower. And that is that shared sense of social identity. And the significance of that is it can change over time and it can change by context. And we know this, particularly in the military, with things like mission command, going back to the Troubles in Northern Ireland, referred to as the Corporal's War. A lot of the decision-making and a lot of the tactical decision-making and the execution was done at the level of the corporal. And you will be far better placed, as will many of our listeners, to wax lyrical about how that changed in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm not going to venture into that space, but I do know that we shifted quite significantly in the interim. But anyway, this leadership model, dual agency theory of leadership, really important because not only is it an explanatory theory, so all of the other theories we have of leadership are descriptive, but the dual agency theory of leadership encompasses authentic leadership, It encompasses servant leadership, all those other sort of theories. This is like a theory that encompasses all of those and can explain those and then some. But it also critically identifies the 4 things that leaders need to do to emerge as leaders, to be identified as leaders by the people that they work with. And so you touched upon it, Peter, in terms of the submariners, loved this particular submarine commander. It's about being one of us. They see that individual as acting in the interests of the group, as being totemic of the group. You are one of us. And then the leadership behaviours to be successful and to be accepted as a leader are that you act in the interests of the group as opposed to pursuing your own self-interest. And that you engage in rites and rituals and things like that cement and augment the reputation of the group. You make people feel good about the group that you are a part of. And we see that very clearly in the military with things like commemoration services, Armistice Day, Remembrance Day, all those sorts of things where we are able to fly regimental colours and be good examples of our group, because at its core, we have this sort of tension between an in-group and an out-group, and we want our in-group, whatever that in-group is, to be successful in our minds and to be a group that we want to be part of. And so we act in the best interests of that group. And critically, one of the things that the dual agency theory of leadership shines a light on is it also explains to us the difference between bright side and dark side, the bright side and dark side of leadership. And so we talk a lot about the bright side characteristics for leadership. We talk about achieving good things and being good people. Who decides what's good? Versus difficult and challenging, narcissistic sort of behaviours, difficult behaviours. So the dual agency theory of leadership can actually explain to us the assault on the US Capitol building, for example. It can explain to us the activity in Gaza. It can explain to us the activity in Ukraine. It can explain to us the genocide in Darfur. It can explain to us things like, and in fact, Alex Haslam and his colleague Stephen Riker, who have identified this theory of leadership, have gone back and looked at Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo's studies. Those who aren't aware, Stanley Milgram, Obedience to Authority, had experimental subjects sit before a board where they thought they were giving an experimental subject an electric shock. In fact, they weren't, but they thought they were. And some of them went right the way up the board and gave the experimental subject, who was a Confederate, in fact, it wasn't an individual who's being tortured, but gave them a life-threatening electric shock because they had answered a question incorrectly. And Philip Zimbardo's famous study, Stanford University in the 1970s, had university students, divided them into prisoners and wardens, and he had to call the experiment off because the wardens started beating the prisoners quite savagely. In both of those instances, they went back and looked at the transcripts, and they found that, in fact, the people who had engaged in those behaviours thought they were doing the right thing. And we have seen this in terms of the genocide, the Second World War, that individuals thought they were doing the right thing. And so how does that shape our policy responses and how we think about and conceive of social influence? Anyway, I've taken that to a complete extreme there. But
it's really quite important, because when we talk about societies like that, I'm often struck by the different cultures that we operate in within coalitions, right? So thinking about a society as a homogenous mass within a coalition, I'm not sure works, right? So the Germans are very known for being very direct, which would work with some people because they understand that Germans are direct, but with other people, it can just really upset them. I mean, it grates and you develop really unproductive dynamics within group performance. I mean, there's something about societies and national culture and leadership that's got to be different as well, right?
So, yes, I think we also need to recognise that these are socially prescribed behaviours. So we talk about what is culture. It's our preferred way of doing things around here. So whether that's a workplace culture or it's a national culture, I think it's also important to recognise that the differences within a group, whatever that group is, of any size, can often be greater than the differences between the groups. And so I talked before about recognising the human condition as existing along a continuum rather than being at a fixed point. And I also mentioned within the Big Five things like openness to experience. So I think I don't like to use the word tolerance. I think acceptance of individual difference is key here. We talked about wartime commanders, but whether you're a wartime commander or you are anybody working in any organisation, I think acceptance of individual differences is key. Recognising how it is that individual likes to operate and then working with it Sometimes that may result in having to have difficult conversations about workplace behaviours. But of course, that's what team charters are for, aren't they? And that's how you shape your organizational culture, is you have a team charter, and getting back to the dual agency theory of leadership, one of the behaviours. And I've been talking to the intermediate command staff course for land, the Defence Academy recently on this, leadership in multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional and multi-domain environments. How do you lead and influence in environments where increasingly your team, your subunit command, your first sort of foray into a formal leadership position involves individuals who aren't dressed in green, and who perhaps even aren't in your leadership chain. So how do you lead and influence those individuals? How do you gain that performance and move that team forward? And so there are definite preferences and cultures, absolutely. That's why they exist, don't they? But I think it's about acceptance of individual differences. And in the workplace, whether it's a military workplace or otherwise, having a team charter that takes the organizational values, which are statements of behavioral intent, and translates them into specific workplace behaviors, puts everybody on the same page in terms of expectations of conduct, how it is that you're going to show up at work, what is inbounds and what is perhaps not appropriate.
And it's funny because those things differ enormously across coalitions, whether it's NATO or an alliance structure or a coalition to counter Daesh or various nations coming together to counter piracy or the Houthis or whatever it is. They're very different cultures that are being brought together, very different societies, very different groups of people. More often than not, in a lot of these coalitions, which are formed very quickly, these things are often the last things to be considered. They're sort of almost when they're on a peacetime footing, right? That's, we need to do something about the culture now, But in terms of making a coalition work effectively, it almost feels like this is the first thing that needs to happen. This is the primordial focus should be these items that should have the first consideration of a commander coming in, that the staff putting together these behaviours, because it's only in that way you're going to get this sort of proper functioning through the multiplicity of agencies and societies that are interacting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, just this week, I was thinking one of the professional challenges that I'm continually faced with is treating the piece of the jigsaw puzzle that I bring to the table, my profession, as a condiment. And to me, it's self-evident that it's not, as you say, and I often have these conversations, we're talking about organizational design, whatever it is, that organizations don't exist on a piece of paper and they don't exist in abstract form. They're living, breathing organisms filled with people. And any system of human organization is bound to be imperfect. And so when we talk about things like organizational design, my first point of reference is let's have a think about the decisions the organization needs to take, the order, the urgency, the decisions that the organization needs to take, and then work from there. But in terms of workplace behaviors, I have long had an expression as well, particularly for those of us who are privileged enough to have a profession and to be knowledge workers or white collar workers. It's never the work, it's always the people. The source of stress that we experience in the workplace, it's never the work, it's always the people, because you've had the luxury of choosing the work, more or less, that you would wish to render. And I'm sure military personnel listening to this will be rolling their eyes thinking, yeah, but that posting I didn't really appreciate. But more or less, you're in a space that you have had the luxury and privilege of choosing. It's often not the work that's the source of stress, it's the people. So yes, I absolutely think that these are things that need to be sort of sorted out and discussed. It's a little bit like, Peter, casting your mind back to when you were a young naval officer, as we both were many years ago, leaving it until 7:59 on a Monday morning to iron 5 shirts for work for the week, as opposed to doing it at some point over the weekend. Think about this stuff in advance because it saves you a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy that you don't otherwise have because you're having to invest that into the delivery of work, and also goodwill. So once these tensions surface in the workplace, they're far more difficult to resolve because people start putting up walls, they start making assumptions about people and their motivations, and not everybody is going to be your cup of tea and vice versa. That's obviously a life lesson we all need to take away, and less focus on being liked, more focus on being competent, but being pleasant and recognizing that there is a job to do and we need to do it to the best of our ability. I've been in operational environments where things have been difficult and challenging, shall we say. I'm not going to go into too many details, but I've had my share of those experiences, and I've been very fortunate in a professional capacity to see them firsthand as well, and then to be advising and guiding on back briefing them. I get it. These things happen quickly, and they're hard, and they're difficult, and they're challenging, but thinking about this stuff in advance can really save the day, in my opinion.
The final bit that I wanted to get to, and I know we're pushed for time, but I said at the start, this is an all ranks game because it very much is, particularly if we move away from that divine general idea. And we move to something that is more focused on leadership where it matters. When I go across the US and people ask you to go and speak about leadership in the US, the audiences you generally speak to that I find are the operators, right? You often go into a room and there's not an officer in there at all. And they're people that the US and indeed the Norwegians and some others, they really want to focus on their operators to give them the skills about making decisions. We don't seem to do that in many European states where discussions over command and control and command and leadership, these are all based around the officer corps. It's almost a very Soviet model, right? It's, the officers need to be trained in these things, but everyone else just gets on with their job. It strikes me that we have something slightly out of kilter with the way we talk about doctrine, the way we talk about leadership, the way we talk about mission command, the way we have lovely speeches which talk about delegation of responsibility, about empowering people. And yet we don't spend a lot of time investing in them to give them the skills. Are there things that are relatively quick wins? I mean, do we have to send everyone away on a year's course to learn this stuff? Is there stuff that we can give to junior NCOs that enables them to be better leaders, to take the least worst decisions? Are there easy things that we can do for militaries?
So in terms of least worst decision making, absolutely. There is a tool developed by Lawrence Allison and Neil Shortland called 7 at 7. 7 minutes to develop, 7 minutes to deliver, 7 minutes to back brief. And when I first became a psychologist, my father, who is a child and adolescent psychologist, and so a very different type of psychologist to me, but said, give the profession away, use it to help people. And that has been my headmark throughout my entire career, is that, I'm not an egotist. I don't always need to be in the room. I don't need to listen to the sound of my own voice. I know what I think. And I'm forever reading and listening and watching and learning to try and deliver a better output. So I'm very much about giving tools and frameworks away to people to animate conversations and improve their knowledge and provide them with the scaffolding with which to work. And so this 7 at 7 tool is fantastic because it's evidence-based, it's field-tested, and it is about creating those least worst scenarios that can be developed at desk level, tactical level, with that subject matter expertise that I don't have, and Peter, you don't have in every environment, and we don't need to, for them to then practice those difficult what-if scenarios. And then we can layer on sort of the more immersive IT-based scenarios and things. But we absolutely can. And I referred before to about the dosage effect in terms of little and often. We know that it actually does improve decision-making ability. And then the education and training, the awareness around and measurement of maximization, satisficing. Where do you sit in relation to those? And how can you reflect on those when you are in these scenarios? That you have a predilection for maximization, or you need to get better at satisficing, perhaps. And I think that's about cleaning your weapon, cleaning your boots, looking after your feet. I often say, I talked about all warfare psychological. The weapon system that I deal with is the mind, and this is part of that kit that people bring to it. In terms of the inclusion aspect, all ranks, absolutely, because statistically, the bulk of the organizational output is occurring at all levels, but predominantly all ranks. And I don't know about the distribution within each of the single services within the British Armed Forces, but I know from my time in the Royal Australian Navy, 70% of the force were sailors. And so in terms of the output, think of your normal curve. How do you get excellent? We need to move the people on the left-hand side of the curve a little bit further right. And so that education and awareness that is practical, applied, if it's field tested, fantastic. And that's why we have applied academic researchers that go out into the field and do all this work and interview people and get all these tools and measurements and things, and then we can apply them and help people to move more quickly. And it's accelerating experience. So it's drawing upon, particularly in the decision-making space, the way some of those scenarios have been developed is to get somebody who's very experienced operationally to talk about least worst decisions. So giving them those characteristics. Before we had those characteristics, we just went and talked to people and said, tell us about the least worst decision. But now we have those characteristics. Tell us about some scenarios that meet some of these criteria, and just listening to people talk. And then you can create those training scenarios and then put people through it, again, accelerating experience, and then go back through it with people and say, right, at decision point A, of the 3 options, you chose the third. A more experienced decision maker would have chosen the first, and this is why.
Sarah, what a brilliant piece to end on. Thanks so much for sparing the time. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Citaware is the world's #1 force integration solution, providing full C4 ISR capability across the globe.
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do subscribe and leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us to reach new audiences and spread the word. The episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for the Wavell Room, a home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.